coming today. Joining us in the celebration of the 215th anniversary of the Olde Meeting House, this building. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the two other presenters today. Adam King, founder and director of Arcadia Restorations. In case you don't know Adam, and I think many people here do, he's skilled in and knowledgeable of preservation and restoration of historic buildings, with a specialty focus on timber framing. And I'll let him introduce himself more later. I'd like to also welcome Susan Chandler, who is manager of the Archive and Resource Center at the Peacham Historical Association. She's been a key person in helping locate and research records and items relating to the church and the meeting house. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Sonia Dunbar. I am the pastor here at the Congregational Church, and I come to this as a person with a layperson's love of historic building techniques, an insatiable curiosity for research, and a slightly quirky ability to read 18th and 19th century poor penmanship. Yeah, take your gifts where you get them. So I also want to thank the Peacham Congregational Church Anniversary Celebration Planning Group. And that was Mel Rice, Patty Gardner, Lorna Quinby, and Sharon Fearer. We came together at the end of 2020 with a desire to celebrate 3 key anniversaries for the church this year. So in addition to the 215th anniversary of the Old Meeting House, this is also the 150th anniversary of the dedication of our organ, and the 227th anniversary of the chartering of the church congregation. So what we're going to do today, this is going to be a little laid back. So the 3 of us are going to take turns sort of offering some information to you and some stories about this building, both from an historical, architectural perspective and contextually. Sort of a window into the people who dreamed this building into being 2 centuries ago. And depending on our timing, we want to be able to give you an opportunity to ask us questions, and hopefully we have answers that correspond with the questions you asked. We hope you enjoy yourselves today. So we want to start out, give you a little bit of the foundation about the church itself. So residents of the town of Peacham originally met in private homes for several years to pray and read the scriptures together. Itinerant preachers, itinerant ministers would come through at various times for various lengths of time. And they would perform baptisms, they would formalize marriages, and they would lead a formal Sabbath worship service when they came through before they headed off to the next town. By April 1794, groups of residents in the town decided that they wanted to come together formally, and so they wrote a charter and established the Peacham Congregational Society. This later became technically the Peacham Congregational Church. The charter is still in existence in the Peacham Historical Association archives, and there is a printout of it on the wall down in the narthex entryway as you come into the church, if you want to take a look at that. The 12 people who originally signed that charter are well-known names for people in Peacham even today. They're common names that we hear: Bailey, Elkins, Foster, Minor, Varnum, Abbott, Skeel, and Walker. And there were 12 men and women who came together that April, and then it expanded outward. More people joined. And with that increase in the number of people who wanted to band together as a spiritual family, they needed to do two things. And that was eventually hire a settled pastor and construct a house of worship. Neither of which happened immediately. So they chartered 1794. It took them 5 years before they hired their first settled minister. And that involved 79 interviews. Rumor has it they did not interview that many when they hired me, but they might not be telling me everything, though. It took 12 years from the point they chartered to the point where the meeting house was actually constructed. So I'm going to turn this over to Susan now to kind of give you a little background on the existence of other churches in town and a little bit on the finding the site for the church.
Thank you, Sonia. I want to back up for just a moment and talk about a little bit of the work that we're doing that has led to some of these discussions. We owe a big debt of gratitude to Lorna Quimby for keeping the records all these years, for gathering information about the church and preserving it for us. We are now digging deeper. We have, I do want to say that within the archives of the Peacham Historical Association, we have found new records that were probably examined by Ernest Bogart, who wrote a history of the town back probably 60 years ago. But we are now reading all of these in the first person, opening up these letters, and it's shedding new light on the early history, the interactions, how things happened. The original church charter was there with the original signatures, all was preserved. The other, we do still have one obstacle, and that is, especially for folks who are new to town, the Peacham Historical Association kept records, but they were located in a building where the new library currently stands. The old library was there. And in 1959, 1 month before the Historical Association opened its building, the white building up on Church Street here, the building burned, and many of the records of the town were lost. So we've had to play detective to try to get back into records, to locate records with what we have to work with. And it's shedding new light. And Sonia has spent a great deal of time over in the archives, as have a number of members of the community. And we are really trying to take a look at everything with a new light based on the letters that we have found. We have all of the original correspondence of Reverend Worcester, Reverend Merrill, Reverend Boutelle, and Reverend Fisk. And of course, they had no copiers in those days, so one wonders, well, how do you have the correspondence from some of these ministers as they sent letters out. They made a copy for themselves. They actually penned a second copy of the letters and put it, so we have dialogues between churches, between the original church elders, and we can start to see what was going on. So it's shedding new light. It's very interesting. This area was, of course, a wilderness when this church was chartered and settled. And I think that we look at it and think, okay, it was just a lot of woods and, you know, they had to cut down the trees and clear the land. But what's been lost in the record is there were raids coming through this area in the late 1700s. There were British raids that came out of Canada, and there are accounts of Deacon Elkins' son Moses was actually captured and taken across the border into Canada. He was shipped over to Ireland and ended up in England until there was a prisoner exchange. We also had, there were a number of attacks by Native Americans still occurring even though the Revolutionary War was over. This was wilderness. This was a tough existence. Many of the original founders came from Newbury and Haverhill. They'd come up from Massachusetts and Connecticut, settled in those areas. But the records show that when they first came here, it was so harsh that they would go back to a more settled area and then they'd return and start again. So this was a rough place to be. We were really the wilderness. And in fact, the original church charter mentions that they are here in the wilderness and they are banding together, that they feel the need to do this. When they decided to actually build the structure of the church, the group that had formed came together, and as many churches go to even to this day, they could not come to an agreement as to where they were going to site the church. So the custom was in those days that you would bring in what they called outsiders or foreigners, meaning folks from other communities, to make the decision for you. And that's exactly what they did. They brought in 5 individuals from surrounding communities who took a look at where to site the church. They came up with a location, and I'm trying to remember the date here. That particular group, they could not get the congregation to agree to it. And so it was defeated, even though it had been recommended. And it took another 2 years before they could bring in another group of foreigners from, and the second group, instead of coming from Haverhill and Newbury, they came from Greensboro, Craftsbury, Hardwick. They came from a different direction. And they are the ones who actually located the site for the church. And the decision was made to build it up on the hill, opposite the fire department. The reasons were that they thought the town was going to grow in that area. That is the area where the academy was going to be located. And they thought it was fair to all of the residents in the town that it would be equal for everyone to drive to that particular point. And of course, it's a very scenic location as well. It has good drainage. So they decided that would be the area. It was voted on and it was agreed to, and they planted a stick. In other words, they staked the claim for that's where it was going to be located. And so that's where it was built. There's some disagreement, and not disagreement, but there's some questioning as to the actual location of that church. And we have talked with a number of other historians. We've looked at the maps. We have a map of the church grounds itself. It does give some indications of cemetery, but it says old cemetery, and then there's a notation for a newer cemetery, which means there were more than one location up there. It shows the main road, but we have recently come across additional maps in our collection at the Historical Association that show that the roads were in different locations, and in fact, there was a different connecting road up there. So this is still to be determined. This is the work that's ongoing, locating the original location. So bear with us. Well, we're going to find it. It's kind of a detective search. It's really interesting to try to locate, and it would be interesting to know what direction the church actually faced, because you're on the top of the hill. My best guess, looking at all of these maps, is that the front of the church faced towards what is now the fire department. But that may be incorrect. It may have been to the west. We're not quite sure. So, no, I don't think it went down the hill. Based upon the road going up, it shows it as a main highway. The side of the church is towards that road. But the roads have also moved. So it's a question, and that not all of the road locations match on all of the maps, because it's such an early time period. So that's what we're dealing with in trying to research this. We're moving forward.
Mel Rice calls this fixing the plane while flying it.
Exactly.
And so a lot of what we're doing seems to be like that at times. But so we've now addressed one of the key issues. They decided they wanted to build a church. So they eventually decide where it's going to go. Then there, of course, becomes the other important question. How are we going to pay for it? So in November of 1801, a local committee of people within the church presented some suggestions for how they could raise the money for the construction of the old meeting house. And so what they proposed was a tax on what they called a tax on the members of the congregation to raise $1,000. Now, $1,000 1801 money corresponds to approximately $21,000 to $22,000 today. So they proposed this tax to have the congregation members pay in a total of $1,000. That was their estimate to erect the frame and sheathe it against the weather during 1802. They also suggested that the remainder of the construction costs be raised through auctioning off the pews. So a year later, in December 1802, there is this fascinating church record where they vote to order the collector of the monies to not to distrain on any member of this society for his share of the $1,000 tax before June 10th. Now, to distrain, that's an old legal term for seizing their property to secure the debt. 1802 Congregationalists did not fool around. Now, at the same time, they also vote to rescind the original approval of the $1,000 tax and rework the procedure to take into consideration the payments that were going to be made for the pews that were going to be auctioned off. And they considered, well, what if we took payment in terms of actual timber? So they had to have a committee meet and come to a decision on that. Then in their final order of business at that meeting, they voted to build a meeting house the size and shape of that in Newbury, Vermont, with a cupola instead of a spire. So we think we're headed toward knowing what's going on, but wait, there's more. September 2002, 2003. 1803. 1803, they voted to rescind all and every vote which has taken place in this society previous to this date respecting the building of a meeting house. 66 voted in favor and 9 against it. They threw up their hands and said, no, we're not even going to deal with this right now. December 1803, everyone had taken a deep breath and they vote to attempt again to build a meeting house and to finance it through the sale of the pews. Now, at this point, they're actually acting instead of waiting on this. So a week later, they hold the sale of the pews. Now, at the back of the sanctuary, we actually have copies of a chart that shows the location of all the pews, who bought it, and an accounting of how much they paid for the pews. So pew number 1 was purchased by Governor Maddox. And he purchased it for, I believe it was $180, so it was roughly equivalent to $4,500 to $5,000. The total amount that they raised was over $5,000 and would be roughly equivalent to between $100,000 and $125,000 in 2021 dollars from auctioning off the pews. So by that point, they've had enough money coming in and they finally can start looking at things like actually agreeing on a plan of what it would look like and hiring the timber framer. So we'll turn this over now to, are you, any more on sticking the stake?
No, when we get done, if there's questions about who some of these settlers were, what denominations they were there other churches in town, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. Why don't we take a look at the timber framing and then we can come back to other questions that might come up. I could actually talk for 2 hours.
So Mel and Sonia and Susan doing some pretty incredible work as far as the historical aspects of the building go. And I've been very lucky to be party to the email back and forth where there's even cooler discoveries that they're coming up with every day. So it's amazing work. My job is really sort of to talk about the building itself, just the building envelope and what it is. We're going to do a little bit of kind of background of timber framing, what that is as a building technology, and we'll talk a little bit about architectural history and what makes a meeting house church, and why the Peacham Church is such a good one. I was lucky enough last year that the Preservation Trust of Vermont, just completely coincidentally, my family are Peachamites, but the Preservation Trust asked me to come in and help the church with their condition assessment on the building, to look at the envelope of the building and the fabric, see what's here, and identify any problems. And this is always the issue, being this preservation carpenter and consultant at the same time, is there's nothing for me to do in this building. It's absolutely, there's maintenance stuff going on, but in terms of the core of the building, people say building has good bones. The bones of this building are essentially in as-new condition from 1808. I mean, it's an extraordinarily well-preserved example of what it is. So this is going to be, there's going to be some history. It's going to go and sound some pretty strange rabbit holes, but just if you start to glaze over, we'll move faster. So I guess the first thing to do is really to talk about what distinguishes a timber frame from a conventional building. As we now know that pretty much every building built since the 1880s or 1890s is done in what we call stick framing, really smaller dimension timbers made at large commercial sawmills. It's the age of the 2x4, and if you've tried to buy a 2x4 in the last 6 months, you know that people are still really quite fond of them. But the timber frame is an older building style that relies on less handling of individual pieces of wood. This is a picture of a barn raising from about 1912, 1913. I think this one was up in Stannard or Greensboro. And as you can see, the smallest dimension timbers in the building are the rafters, and they're usually 4x6s or 4x8s. but the rest of the building is mostly going to be 8 by 8s. As you move forward in time, generally speaking, the timbers tend to get smaller. If we're talking about 18th century buildings, they're sometimes 10 by 10s or even 12 by 12s or larger. And as we get to sort of the post-Civil War era, they start to shrink. They become 6 by 6s, they become 4 by 4s. Because we were clear-cutting New England, there really were, the timber stocks were becoming extremely low, and the big commercial sawmills in the Pacific Northwest could mill huge quantities of small dimension timber, ship them on freight cars, and build streetcar suburbs. It's what gave us that great freedom of shape with the sort of the Queen Anne and what we might call the late Victorian era. So that was kind of the demise of timber framing and the rise of this sort of freer expression of architectural ideas. Timber frames are great, but because of the nature of the way they're put together, they have to be more or less rectilinear, sort of square or rectangular. Yeah, Bruce?
Is there anything in what you can see of that structure that you can call out as geographically or chronologically sort of pinpointed?
Not necessarily. I mean, this is pretty late as far as timber framing goes. Timber framing didn't really survive that long into the 20th century. And by then, it had become more or less standardized. Before the Civil War, there were several different systems for laying out and constructing timber frames. But it was actually kind of an American innovation in about the 1840s that let us take what had been previously an extremely tailor-made process for fitting together wooden joinery and almost coming up with an assembly line process. We invented the ability to standardize parts for timber frames. So you could get a yard full of carpenters and give one set of dimensions for all of those posts, cut them on the ground and raise the frame and know that everything would go together. And that was not something that happened before. So after the Civil War, you see a lot more uniformity in the way that timber frames are built. That's kind of what we came up with, a way to build quickly with timber. So there's nothing that really distinguishes this particular frame from something you would find in Indiana or Ohio or Montana or even further west. Timber frames get thinner as we get further west purely because of the late dates of settlement in that part of the country. If this were a barn that had been enlarged from a smaller one, then yeah, there may well have been hints from an earlier building that we could look to. And so to talk a little bit about what makes timber framing distinct, the terms post and beam and timber frame are often used interchangeably. Buildings' core structural elements being vertical posts and horizontal beams to support the structure of a building. So all timber frames, this is slightly pedantic, but all timber frames are post and beam buildings, but not all post and beam buildings are timber frames. A true timber frame can only be held together with wooden joinery. And this is a little sort of basic terminology. The mortise and the tenon are the core of what makes a timber frame what it is. So on the left, you have those red arrows. Those are pointing at tenons, the end of timbers that have been shaped into sort of a ridge or an end on the end of the timber itself that fit into the blue outlined areas. Those are the mortises. So that is your timber, the basic timber joint. You find it in furniture, you find it in everything. And then those are secured with hardwood pins that are drilled through the timber, through the tenon, and through the other side. So it's a mechanical connection, which is really quite strong. And another added detail with this kind of joinery is that not just mortise and tenon, but actual physical interaction between mating surfaces on timbers. On the top right, we're looking at the bottom side of where the blue arrow is on the left. And if you can see, there's been a dovetail cut into the bottom of that timber. So on the left here, the timber with the blue arrow pointing at it is going to drop down onto the tenon indicated by the red arrow, and that dovetail is also going to fit into the member crossing over it. This is called an English tying joint, and it was used in the 18th century, and it's incredibly strong. Relies entirely on mechanical connections, and unless something happens to the barn underneath it, it's effectively indestructible if it stays in good condition. This is something that kind of fell out of favor. Bruce, this kind of goes to what you were talking about. If we see this kind of joinery, we know where we are and we know when we are. But if we get to the later style, which is a lot simpler, the sort of more natively American kind, it becomes a lot more uniform. But this is essentially what makes a timber frame what it is. It has to be all timber joinery secured with wood. And it's a flexible kind of work. Like other sort of post-and-beam buildings use bolts or plates or iron brackets, and they don't have the same dimensional flexibility that timber does. So when a building moves, things tend to break or pull apart or shear rather than flex together kind of as a whole. It's a living material, so it's not designed to do that, but it's one of its more desirable properties. This is a little bit of a digression, but it sort of comes to why timber frames come to look how they do in the 18th century in the North American colonies and afterwards. And it's timber framing is essentially a medieval technology. It's there are depictions of timber frame trusses in antique art from Greece and ancient Rome. So we know that this technology dates from then at the very earliest, or that's the earliest point we know of. It likely dates from before that even. And then carried on as a tradition in the West, and particularly in Europe, essentially unchanged until the 17th century. And the reason it sort of is in this photograph. So this is a house in England that's a 16th century timber frame house, mostly made out of oak. And so you have the 16th century portion of the house is on the right, and the 17th century portion is on the left. And you can see the difference between the two of them is you have these oak studs on the right, infilled with wattle and daub, which is essentially mud and straw. And then on the left, it's a similar construction, but the studs are spaced further apart. And the reason for that is because the 17th century in Europe was the great age of sail and discovery and the huge navies of these sort of golden age European powers, Spain and Portugal and England and France. So the oak forests of Europe had essentially been decimated. They were gone. So builders were having to learn how to do more with less, and that's the only key thing to really retain when we talk about American timber framing is that there's a reason that timber frames don't look like this in North America. If we had unlimited oak from shore to shore, then they very well might be. You don't need to be a trained carpenter really to put together a building like that. You throw as much timber at it as you possibly can and fill in to seal out the drafts, and that's basically it. So then when we move to the American colonies, we've got the Fairbanks House in Dedham, Mass. This is the oldest framed house in North America. And it's an extremely early building, 1634. But to look at it, it doesn't really look like an American building as such. This is really still a European medieval type building. One of the things that tips you off to that is the pitch of the roof has an extremely steep roof pitch. And the reason for that is because the earliest first period colonial houses would have still had thatched roofs on them. And thatched roofs work brilliantly in a sort of temperate climate of sort of Central Europe, but they don't shed snow and they tend to rot. So that's a real hint that this was an early means of building. And we have some additions. We've got a small forge, and then we've got another building on that side. So we hadn't really arrived. And the thing that this building isn't responding to is the sheer crush of demand for houses in the American colonies. In 1643, there were 21,000 people living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and we look at manifests of ships from the time, and the professions, the trades that were on these ships were overwhelmingly carpenters. There was a huge demand for houses and not enough people to build them. Sometimes you hear this thing that the early houses were made by shipbuilders who were brought over, but in fact it's exactly the opposite. The shipbuilders were trying to drag timber framers into the yards to build fishing boats and trading ships. So what we were trying to find is a way of building a sort of a unified type of structure that could be put up quickly to respond to this demand. And the carpenters who were coming over were generally pretty young. They tended to be in their early 20s or early 30s, so we're talking about European and English carpenters from the south of England who maybe had finished an apprenticeship and rather go into a pretty constrained European guild system, go where the getting was good in the colonies, and start developing new ways to build buildings out of local materials and using new methods. So if we jump forward a little bit to the 1670s, we start looking, this looks more like a New England house. It's a lot simpler, it's a single structure, there's less going on. Part of the simplicity had to do with the fun-loving nature of the Puritans. They really didn't want any decoration on their buildings whatsoever. So it was as simple materials as possible, locally sourced. We had a great supply of really great bog cedar and white cedar, which turned into clapboards and shingles. So then you start to have the real look and the shape of a New England building. And you jump forward again, and this is a method that we didn't come up with. This was common to agricultural buildings in Europe, but the bent style of construction. When you see a traditional barn raising, they're arranged in bents, and this is a term that we're going to keep coming back to. And a bent is essentially a cross-section of a timber frame building. So you have a bent on the left, you can assemble as many of those bents as you like, stand them upright and join them together, and that will give you your basic house frame. I just want to make sure that I'm not running over what you guys wanted to get into. I'm missing a sheet, but just wave at me when I need to stop. So on the left you have what might be a typical sort of low-posted cape, and on the right a sort of two-story I-house. I mean, these are two really archetypal New England house types. And this is bent construction. This is what the benefits of it are. You can assemble these bents on the ground, and then you get everybody you possibly can together with push poles and stand the bents upright and connect them together. It's a much faster way of building. And the house shapes, so the reason we're talking about house shapes is because the house shapes start to influence the way that timber frames and that religious buildings like the meeting house come to resemble as well. One of the easiest ways to date a timber, and I'm sure this is a review for a lot of you folks here, is the difference between hewn and sawn timbers. Before the sort of widespread adoption of sawmills, there were sawmills in the very early American colonies, but they were generally slow. Their capacity was extremely limited, and really they were designed to mill out boards more than anything else. Prior to the sawmill, to mill out a board, you needed 2 people, and each board had to be sawn out by hand. Then you came up with these water-powered vertical mills with 4 or 5 blades ganged up together that could mill out boards like crazy. But timber work was still almost entirely done by hand, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. If you're bothering to clear a piece of land for a homestead, you may as well turn the timbers into your house. So it involves turning a round log into a square timber using axes, adzes, and chisels. And it really wasn't until after the Civil War that sawmills became big enough and cheap enough that transporting timbers and handling timbers and sawing them out became commercially viable. It was just the simplest way to do it was to do this by hand, and it was an incredibly laborious and sort of time-intensive process. This is a house in Northfield from about 1845, when it was still a fairly common practice. Smaller dimension timbers in even these early buildings tended to be sawn out, but this is the kind of timber that the Peacham Church is entirely made of. Every major timber in this building was shaped by hand. That's the only reason to really bring that up.
Let me jump in for
Sure.
a second here. One of the things that is kind of fascinating about the old meeting house here is we actually know who the timber framer was, who initiated this, the hand-hewn work that Adam has been talking about. So the timber framer was named Edward Clark. He was born around 1760 and was a Revolutionary War veteran. He served in 1779, served under Colonel Moses Hazen, cutting the Hazen Road from near Peacham through to Hazen's Notch. There is some family history, which of course by the time you get to family legends and family history, may be true, may not be true, but there are some family stories that he may have been an aide to Lafayette. And there are multiple descendants of his whose first or middle name was Lafayette. 1783, he actually fought in the Battle of Yorktown that led to the defeat of Cornwallis and the end of the war. He was wounded in that battle. He got hit in the leg by a spent ball, was laying there, and they are about to pick him up and take him to the Army hospital for care. That's not good. Army hospitals in the Revolutionary War was essentially where you went for the Army doctors to mangle you before you died. So what most soldiers attempted to do was to actually go to a private home. They would pay whoever owned the home to be able to stay there and have a private doctor come in to care for them. So there's this discussion over whether he's going to the hospital or whether he is going to the private home. And the story is Lafayette went by, walking by, heard the discussion, and said, take him to a private home, and flipped a guinea to him to pay the person at the private home. He recovers from that, gets married in 1792, moves to Peacham around 1793, and actually builds other churches in the area. Now, I believe he was the timber framer for Newbury.
He did
Believe so,
Newbury.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we think, again, from the records, we're finding new information all the time, but the official building oversight committee in 1803 was granted the power in 1803 to actually hire and contract with a timber framer to begin the planning and the construction of the building.
And he was very, very good at what he did, too. He was a hell of a timber framer. To talk about the constraints of, doing more with less and complicated joinery and how difficult it was to hew out timbers with any accuracy. And then we talk about assembly methods, and this is the assembly method we see in the Peacham church, is what we call a scribe frame. Earlier we were talking about the American innovation of basically being able to come up with interchangeable parts for timber framing, but that really didn't happen before 1720, say. That really was a 1730s, 40s innovation. Before that, we were back to the medieval technology of scribe frame. And scribe framing essentially means these are images of rafters. So you have the diagonal member as a rafter, and this is from the Boardman House in Saugus, which I think is 1680 something. But this method was essentially unchanged right through until the 1720s. And what you have to do is you make your rafter and you cut a mortise in it, and rather than cut a standardized tenon that fits all of your mortises, you have to lay whatever piece goes into that timber directly on top of it and scribe or custom cut that joint so that it fits together. So every single joint, every single piece of wood has to be custom cut, fitted, taken apart, sometimes refitted, and it's incredibly labor intensive. And so that's why you get these great marks on older timber frames of that age, and it's a really great way of dating a timber frame. As if you see these marks, these what they call marriage marks, these are assembly instructions. So it knows, that joint number 3 goes into mortise number 3. That's how it has to go together. It can't go together any other way. And we see those in the Peacham church as well. So this is you can't really see it, unfortunately. But this is a picture, if you catch it in the right light, you put a lead on the wall and really help me. But these are marriage marks that are up in the Peacham church. And they start with Roman numerals, but eventually the building is complicated. You have to completely give up on Roman numerals. You have to start inventing new numerals. So there are 3 slashes that way, there are 2 the other way, and there's a circle across all of it. And to the timber framer putting it together, he would have known exactly where this piece would have gone in the building. He would have known which part of it, if it was in the roof system, or if it was in the ground level system, or if it was on the east or the west side of the building. This would have told him everything he needed to know. And other framers on the site as well who would have been largely illiterate. And so I guess the next part is to talk about how the roof is actually built, because that's kind of the most impressive part of the building. In an already a very impressive building. And it's worth talking about what,
Adam, could you may have mentioned that what species of trees were they using, and were they local or were they brought in?
They were all local, yeah, they were all local, especially with a building this size. I mean, this is nearly a 50-foot clear span up here. There just wouldn't have been any practical way to get timbers that size in here. So they were mostly going to be softwood species for big spans like this, so they were going to be spruce and fir. Pine more often than not. Smaller dimension timbers tended to be hardwood. In this building, I believe they're beech and they're maple, and there's a smattering of oak as well. Small early frames, really early sort of 18th century frames to mid-18th century frames, even 18th century frames here in Vermont tended to be all hardwood for smaller frames just because it was easier to handle. But for a span this big, it's already enormously heavy timber to lift, so these tended to be softwood. For a very good reason, because they had to place some interesting demands on them in terms of building trusses. So this is another little kind of terminology, just sort of coverage, just to get everybody on the same page about what a truss actually is. And a truss is essentially a rectangular arrangement of structural members that makes it incredibly stiff and can be completely self-supporting. If you just have rafters that are resting directly on the top of a wall, any kind of load downwards will exert a thrust out on the walls, which isn't great, especially with a building as enormous as this one. So you build a truss, and this is a Kingpost Trust. And again, this is an extremely old technology. There are depictions of this in antiquity. We know it's at least 2,000 to 3,000 years old and still being used today. But timber is incredibly stable axially, meaning along the grain. It can be compressed to a huge amount with virtually no dimensional change at all. but flexing is a lot more dynamic. So the truss is designed so that all the timbers are acting essentially either in tension or compression against each other. So if you look at the diagram, if the tie beam, which runs along the bottom, which in truss terms we call the bottom cord, if that wants to go down, it can't because the king post in the center is restraining it. And the king post itself can't come down because those two diagonal main braces, which are directing force down to the plate. So essentially, the truss system means that the walls, all the walls have to do is resist racking this way, but also just to bear the weight of the trusses themselves. So the trusses aren't exerting any force on the posts except for a vertical one, which, as we said, given the sort of axial stability of wood, is a very, very strong arrangement. This is actually a drawing of the trusses in the church. There are 9 of them, I believe. Yeah, and I think they're 9 feet apart each one. And they are immense. So to give you some sense of the dimensions, I lost the paper that actually has the dimensions written on them, but I can kind of remember it. The rafters are 7 by 8s. They're 30 feet long. The other timbers are similarly dimensioned. They're 7 by 8s in these main braces and the straining beam in the middle. And the bottom cord, the main tie beam, is an 11 by 14-inch pine timber. It's a huge timber that stands at 48 foot 4, 48 foot 8 in the clear. And it's essentially, like I said before, is in as-new condition. It's they're essentially perfect. There's been a lot of testing of timber trusses after the fact, and the builder would have had a choice between going with a Kingpost Trust, like you saw in this one. This is actually this is the truss that's in the Stratfor townhouse. They decided to go with a Kingpost Trust. They're only separated by a few years. But here, with the Queenpost Trust, the Queenpost Trust has been shown by engineering studies after the fact to have been stronger. The builder himself wouldn't have been an engineer. That term didn't really exist in the early 18th century, or the early 19th century, I should say. But they were builders, architects, and designers all in one, and he intuitively knew that this would be a better design to go with. This is a little close-up, and I'm sorry that it's so bad quality, but this is a close-up of the middle of the sort of bottom cord where the 2 queen posts come into that tie beam. And if you imagine the dotted line with the 2 dots in the middle, the 2 dots are 2 oak dowel positions, and the dotted lines delineate where a mortise is inside that bottom cord member. And if you notice, one side of it is pitched. So you have a half dovetail shaped tenon in the end of those queen posts. So they are brought down into the post is strained upward, or the tie beam is strained upward, and then a wedge is driven in next to that half dovetail to bring that angled mating face against the inside of the mortise in that tie beam. So this is a wedge half dovetail joint, which essentially has no mode of failure. They are known to fail in inferior pieces of wood, and you get some creak here and there, but this is an unbelievably strong mechanical joint. And the advantage of that is that it gives the trusses camber, so they actually rise from one end across the span to the other end. And you see that in bridge construction. You see that in covered bridges. Covered bridges are usually truss construction, but they have this camber in them because that essentially preloads the trusses. So that means when they are subjected to load, they have a degree of resistance before even any force can really begin to act on them. So this is, with the combination of the joinery and the arrangement of this, and there's nearly 1 foot 4 inches, so 16 inches higher in the middle than it is over its length in a timber that's 16 inches deep. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but it's just an impressive engineering feat. And then they were assembled on the ground and brought up onto the roof. And to be honest, we just don't know how they did that. There are any number of ways that it could be done. There's evidence in some other meeting houses of places where lifting tackle has been attached. But we sort of, in a lot of ways, we know more about how the pyramids were put up than how meeting houses were put up. They were immense, heavy timber pieces raised by hand by swarms of carpenters, but it still must have been an unbelievable achievement to actually see it done.
So, Adam,
Yeah.
sorry to be a geek.
No, not at all.
The Kingpost illustration you had no camber. Is that just coincidental?
The Stratfor Church has a little bit of camber, but not as much.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a little bit of camber, not as much. And this is one where again, in the caption, this is from Jan Lewandowski's book. This one did have pulley mortises on the face of the tie beam to be used for lifting. So
The camber was a matter of choice.
it was a matter of choice. It was a matter of what it was expected to do, the nature of construction. Like I say, the Kingpost Trust, because there are two posts, has a much greater ability to exert an upward force on a timber of that size. So it may have simply been a product of that's as much camber as they were able to get out of it.
The force is all about that document.
Yeah, exactly. So the queen posts in this illustration, these aren't bearing on the lower cord member, the tie beam. They're restraining it upwards. And the main braces coming down to close to where the rafter tails are additionally helping to support the tie beam. And again, the trusses have been examined over and over and over again, and as far as we can tell, there's no sort of vector for failure or damage at all. They're new. Yeah, Ellie.
I'm sort of assuming you could only do that in completely green wood.
Yeah, it would have been completely green originally. Maybe left a season for a short amount of time. The braces may have been left a season. It's difficult to tell because obviously it's all bone dry now, but we have some indication that, yeah, larger sticks like that probably would have been green.
Shaped to be a slice.
No, it wasn't. It's actually bent into that shape by the force of the truss. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Today's world, we have structural engineers to design.
Indeed, we do, and they don't like timber frames.
This would have been outside of carpenter's building. So who would have done the engineering?
The engineering was done by the carpenter. I mean, it's interesting when we look at the historical record about the way that job titles worked. There were carpenters, there were framers, there were joiners. These were people who all had very distinctive jobs. Joiners were people who did furniture. Carpenters were people who would build sort of cabinetry and interior work. And then you have the framer, who really he's dealing with a technology that's extremely old, it's extremely established. There is no real engineering around this at all. In a way, they're sort of poorly engineered because they're medieval, they're overbuilt, they're incredibly strong. It's one of the reasons you see so many barn frames that have survived to the present day in New England, because they're essentially overbuilt. They're incredibly rugged buildings. So no, the engineering was purely intuitive. This is a model that works. We're just going to reproduce it, and it'll work again. And yeah, it's still here. And then I think, let's see, oh yeah, and then this is the last image that I have until I turn it back to Sawn and Susan. This is an image taken inside the roof system, and in a way it's a shame that more people don't get a chance to see it, because it is a masterwork. This is actually, so Jen Lewandowski, who I work with, unfortunately couldn't be here today. He literally wrote the book on early American roof trusses, and this is the cover of his book. So the Peacham Church is on the cover. Because it's that good. And you have all this sort of longitudinal bracing to stop it from racking either side, and you can sort of see a little bit the kind of the camber of those timbers as they approach the center line of the church. But all the joinery is incredibly tight. There doesn't even look like animals have really ever lived up there. I mean, it's truly, if there were a museum dedicated to roof trusses, this would have to be the star exhibit. It's really incredible. As a friend of mine put it, he said that it's dense with timber, but there's nothing in here that's not superfluous. There's nothing in there that's not doing some kind of structural work of some kind or another. So it's really, it really is kind of a masterpiece of early roof construction, and it survived a little bit of a trip down the hill, seemingly with no issues. So that's to you guys for what happened next.
You want to start? I can start. Go ahead. So as we talked about before, the original church was at the top of the hill. It had a slightly different configuration from what we see today. The basic structure was the same, but the tower was a different configuration. It had two sets of windows. It had a U-shaped mezzanine that would have come around this room. It was slightly shorter than this building. They added 12 feet on when they brought it down. So why did they bring it down? Why didn't they just leave it at the top of the hill? There were several economic reasons, and then I think there was a religious, political reason as well. The building itself was starting to leak. It had roof issues, it had heating issues, it needed a chimney, but more importantly, the village had grown up down here. They moved the academy down here, the stores were all down here, the village was forming here, and that happened in New England towns. This is not unusual. For any of you who have ever visited over in Hardwick, East Hardwick was the original village, and that was the center of that town. And then commerce moved into what is now the village of Hardwick, and East Hardwick was sort of left as a backwater. This happened all over New England. So the decision was made to bring the church down the hill and have it be situated in the center of the village. This land was donated by Dr. Shedd, who was one of the deacons of the church. He was very, I could talk for an hour about Dr. Shedd and his work. Yes?
How old was the church at that point?
We're talking 1843.
They made the decision, they were having the discussions in 1843, and it was moved in 1844,
Right.
To the best of our knowledge.
One of the other considerations was the fact that another church had been built here in town. Where the town offices was the Methodist Church. That church was organized in 1831, and the structure was built in 1832. At the time that they I should back up and tell you that we do not have many records from the Methodist Church. Because that church eventually lost membership, and there's a long story why that happened, and we won't go into that today unless somebody asks, but the building was sold in 1930. But we lost the records for that church. So we are working back in time to reconstruct what was going on. We do know that by 1843, the Methodist Church had more members than the Congregational Church. It was located in a better location. It also had many of the wealthy and notable individuals in town as members. Within the family that I belong to, the Chandler family, we know that Samuel A. Chandler, who was one of the early surveyors of this town, initially joined the Peacham Church. We have the record for him becoming a member and also purchasing a box pew. And yet, in 1833, he purchased a box pew in the Methodist Church. We also have the correspondence from the ministers, and we're starting to see people leave the church. Either they're moving away, they're moving west, or some of them are transferring membership into other denominations. So the Peacham Church itself was having some pressure. It was located not in the center of the village. They were losing some membership. The action is all happening down here. The structure needs repair, and the decision was made to move it down into this area. Plus, they had a lot which had been given to them. So it made sense for them to come down here. Everything else had been moved down here.
So they,
Question about the records, Susan.
Yes,
Records that you're sifting through, what form are these records?
they are letters. They are correspondence letters. There are also documents, correspondence that are coming in from other churches. So if a member wants to join a church and they belong to a church in another community, you have the record of their application to come to this church. They also get recommendations, and sometimes they are not recommended by the minister or the deacons of another church. Those are very interesting records when you find that someone's saying, no, you don't want them as part of your church. And that did happen. So we know where they're coming from, we know their denominations, we know when they're leaving the Congregational Church, they're transferring their membership to another denomination, and we have the records of much of that paperwork. So you also have a whole record of where people are, who's coming in, who's leaving, who's going to another church, and where are the locations people are leaving for, whether it's out of state or to another part of the state or to another denomination.
So as you're doing your work, is there an effort underway to preserve archaeology?
Yes.
About these records?
The first thing we're doing, we discovered these documents in the last 6 months, really. Yeah. And so Sonia and I have started the work. We are, the first thing that has to be done is you have to look at the conditions, sort them, see what you've even got in there, which we have done. And then we're going to have to put together a program for preservation. Right now they're being opened up and they're being put into acid-free sheet, like their sleeves to protect them. They're not open to the public, although someone could come in and take a look by appointment. They are in sleeves. Some of them are in sleeves, not all of them. And then we're talking about perhaps doing a book. We may need to apply for a grant. We need to digitally preserve these. This is a very, very impressive and important record for not only this church, but for church history here in New England. It's extraordinary. There are very few complete records like this.
And these records that she is speaking about, these letters, this is, it has now been lovingly named the Red Box. Because it is a red ladies' union suit box from
Victorian era, maybe 1870s, 1880s.
And so when you open this up, all the letters are folded down to being roughly 2/3 the size of an index card, for those of us who remember index cards. And there are probably 200.
I'd say there's more than that. And they were out of order. They were pushed together and wrapped with string and just laid out in this box. I've written an article that's coming out in the next Peacham Patriot, just giving you an overview. It tells you a little bit about what's in the collection and also about a glimpse into the lives of the early settlers here, because there were, and I don't want to, digress from today's topic, but just as we could do an entire talk on the contents of what we call the Red Box, which might be interesting for the community. But what we're finding is, not that it was a lawless area, but because we did have a sheriff, but most land disputes, the court system was not developed yet. Land disputes with your neighbors, familial problems were brought to the church and adjudicated. The elders would go out and investigate, and then pressure was put on one or more parties to settle the incidents that were occurring. There was a great deal of drinking, there was violence, there was, you name it, it was going on. This is the wilderness, and you have people coming in from all different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different education levels, and they're all being thrown into the mix here in the wilderness. And we tend to look at this as being this, quiet area where people are, carving out farms. It's far more colorful, we'll say. Peacham also had one of the highest number of stills, the alcohol consumption, and that would lead into another whole topic and discussion we could do another time about the temperance movement and what happened here, and how this community was at the forefront of temperance here in the United States. All of this ties together over time.
So, just like so one of making a decision whether to preserve a church, how it was going to be preserved, and where it was going to be located was a very big deal, because it wasn't simply a home for the specific worship community. A church, because the church essentially served the equivalent of the justices of the peace, the mediators, the juries for misdemeanors and what we might call civil crimes today. The churches had a dramatic impact on the emotional, moral, philosophical mores of a community. So that's one of the reasons why it was a big deal for the church. I mean, we're not talking a tremendous difference in distance to be at the top of the hill versus being here. But you have the symbolic visualization of you are being solid and grounded within the community. And so how the church looked, where it was located, had a dramatic effect on the community as a whole.
Yeah, and one of the great things about dealing with churches, and what gives us a great insight into the way they were built and framed, is that churches keep great records generally, which is quite nice. But the social history is extremely rare to have. We do know, however, for instance, with a lot of timber frames, how many gallons of cider per man per day on raising day.
Yeah.
It was something staggering. It was
Yeah,
like 10
it's
gallons
impressive.
per day per man. It's a miracle they got the thing up.
And I just want to add, Adam, I just want to add one comment to support what Adam's talking about. We've discovered the earliest financial records for this church, and interestingly, they are in the back of one of the school ledgers. They took the back, you have to turn it around, turn it up, and in the back section are the earliest payments for the church, the earliest records of sums coming in, and just as an aside, I can tell you that if you were not giving, tithing, or supporting the church to the best of your ability, they came after you. And there are records of that. They really did. They monitored all of that. And we have the payments that were made to Reverend Worcester. We have the payments made for repairs to the building. We have those records. So those are in the archives of the Historical Association. They're humidity-controlled vaults. They are temperature-controlled. They are hardwired for security. We have security cameras on all of this. So when you have supported the building of that structure, you are also supporting the preservation of a lot of these records here in the town. Yes, Barry?
It's interesting to remember that in the 1840, the population of Peacham was twice what it is now.
That's correct. And that was one of the factors that led to the demise of the Methodist Church, among many others. That was much later in the century, but that was the beginning of the problem.
The records in this red box, are they from a variety of different sources? Or is it like one designated historian that's
In terms of the sources, I mean, they were the minister's records. So these are really the social and religious records of the church. We also have letters that came back from the missionaries that were sent out. This church had a very strong, missionary outreach, not only to Native Americans, but what were the islands? They were in the Pacific.
The Sandwich Islands, which became Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of places they were sent. We have letters that came back describing the conditions, what was going on what is life like out on the territories. This is pretty extraordinary material to have. But to answer your question, there are documents that came in from other churches. This church mediated disputes because the elders were so well respected and so well known. This church was really a beacon. And so when there were disputes, for example, in Newbury Church, there's just problems down in Montpelier, Hardwick, the deacons of this church were sent out, and there's records of what they were looking at, what their decisions were, what were they seeing. It's truly remarkable.
Susan, not just factually. A, do you know when the boneyard was established up on the hill? And B, are the records of any other buildings from that original settlement being moved down?
The church, the earliest graves up, you're asking for that?
Yeah.
I don't have the date. I mean, there's more than one. We have more than one. There were many cemeteries here, actually. That's another whole discussion. I mean, most people know about the earliest cemetery, which is down the hill. There's the Worcester cemeteries, there's the Duisburg cemetery, and then we were finding out that there were some other cemeteries that were actually plowed over. We have lost cemeteries in this town over time.
But that occupied one side of what was originally the town green, right?
Right. And the Academy building was also moved.
So the academy came down there. do we know of any other? I mean, I just wondered if there was a migration and we got.
Well, they also had to rebuild all the horse sheds, which, if you think about it, it's not just the church that's set up there on the grounds. We have the maps that show all the outbuildings that service the church. So if you had a horse and carriage or horse and buggy later on and you went to church, where did you park it? You had your own horse shed. The church didn't own the horse sheds. It was owned by the individuals who belonged to the church. They had to maintain them. And so horse sheds were also brought down or rebuilt around this church. Our horse sheds were out back. The Methodist Church horse sheds were in the lot immediately on this side, and it was filled, both of them. They're just, it looks like a shanty town.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
unbelievable to look at those early drawings and photographs.
So we'll
All
make
right.
sure we don't go too much farther off
For the
topic
sake of
here.
brevity, I'll skip a very long and very boring digression into first period architecture, and we'll get straight to the Whipple Matthews House in Hamilton, Mass, 1683. And so the reason this is important is because we now have a distinct and original New England vernacular architecture. This house, this kind of house, only really exists in the Northeast. To a certain extent in British Canada, but really you can't pretty much be anywhere else but in New England in the 18th century. And that's important because this becomes the archetypal house. And we are starting to see some influence from the Baroque in Europe, the creeping in of some classical influences. You start to see little classical details like the columns and the pediment around the door. The Puritans had started to release their stranglehold on decoration. And, they were getting pretty excited about stuff like this. And then we come to the meeting house. So at long last, we've arrived. This is the New England meeting house in its purest form. The meeting house itself derives out of a tradition of a combination of a secular and a religious building in one. And like we've been talking about, this really was the frontier. You couldn't go in straight away, steam right in and build a church. Even though it was mandated by law that there was worship on Sundays in a lot of towns and states. This was a vital building to be put up initially, but it had to serve dual roles. And so they didn't ever really look explicitly religious. They really looked like a house. If you didn't know that this was a meeting house in Rockingham, you might well think that this is just a large dwelling. Just simple clapboard siding, virtually no decoration, divided light, double hung windows, and white cedar shake on the roof. And this really was the form of the meeting house for the bulk of the 18th century. The oldest one that still exists is in Hingham, Mass. It's 1687. The Rockingham Meeting House, 1787, is one of the later ones, but this is, a lot of people think this is the most important building in Vermont, and there's a really strong argument to be made for that. Because after this point, a lot of towns that started to develop a bit more prosperity started putting money into making them look more explicitly church-like. When town buildings were being built, then meeting houses were being constructed with spires, or old meeting houses were having those retrofitted with spires. This is also kind of tied into the concept of the garrison house, which we saw in the sort of 17th and 18th century. A house in town of a substantial size that could accommodate an entire town in the event of essentially retaliation or attack by indigenous people. So the shape of this building would not have been alien to people in the 18th century. It wouldn't have been thought of odd, even at all, that combined the dual roles in a structure like this. It wasn't even used for weddings. Marriages were typically conducted in people's homes, so this was heavily used. And they tried to delineate the uses slightly. Oftentimes the meeting house would have two entrances. You can see that here. You would imagine that the sort of religious entrance would be the one on the end, but it's not. It's actually the one on the side. In a traditional meeting house, the orientation of the church was turned 90 degrees, so you would come in the side door and be facing directly against to the pulpit along the long wall. Any spire in northern New England was vanishingly rare before 1790. They just really didn't exist. So the Rockingham meeting, and if you have a chance to go see it, look at it, it's great. And it's sitting right up on a big old mound, kind of just as the Peacham one would have been originally. As we move towards buildings, churches starting to be more exclusively religious in nature, you start to wind up with something like this, which is this is the Stratfor townhouse of 1799. Which again is an extraordinary building. It's incredibly well preserved. It's in a lot of ways, if you wanted to know what the old meeting house in Peacham looked like originally, you probably couldn't find anything in Vermont that's a hell of a lot closer than the Stratfor townhouse. It has the tower on the front with an open belfry, still very recognizably a meeting house, very simply decorated with sort of, and in its position and siting as well, it would have been a cousin along those lines. And also would have had a double sort of, a second level gallery in the second level. And this one, though it doesn't have its box pews now, would have originally much like Peacham did. And then sort of the shape tends to evolve. This next example is, or sorry, there's the old meeting house on the hill. So you can see how close they are to each other. They really would have been siblings in a lot of ways. And then a further evolution later on. This is the Old West Church in Calais. Again, another superb example. If you have the chance to go take a look at it, it's outstanding. It's completely original. It's never had electricity. No one ever even painted the inside of it, and the front door is unlocked. So I highly recommend you go look at it. But this was a sort of a middle phase where churches were expanding a little bit. They were trying to modify the form slightly. So it would have originally, the Old West Church originally looked very much like the old meeting house on the hill. It's about 20 years later, but they've pushed the front wall out to engage the tower, which gives you a small vestibule on the ground floor and also encloses staircases going to the second floor galleries. And then we get to the Peacham Church. So as my understanding of it goes, the Peacham Church had a huge campaign of renovations in, I think, 1868 to 73, if I'm remembering the dates right.
Yeah.
And a whole heck of a lot happened to the building. After the Civil War, we started to see the craze for the Greek revival, whereas earlier meeting houses like the Old West Church, which is from 28 or 38, were still very plain, very recognizably meeting house buildings. After the Civil War, we start to see a great fad for bringing in decorative influences from the old world. And you don't have to look anywhere further than the main street here in Peacham to see just how deeply rooted and popular the Greek revival was. All of these column-fronted houses combined together with the church to make what is the Peacham Village Historic District. And it's really the Greek revival influences that did that. So the church was completely gone through. The box pews were taken out. The gallery was removed. And in addition to, much like the Old West Church, that pushed the wall forward to engage that tower, the Peacham Church goes even further with a sort of elaborate Greek temple-style pavilion on the front of it with a pediment running behind it. The decoration on the outside of the church that was applied in this renovation is pretty academically and strictly Greek classical in a lot of ways. It's difficult to see here, but we now have pilasters at the corners, sort of false pillars, and at the corner of the front of the building, these wooden shapes look like stone coins. So they're really trying to bring in some ancient temple architecture, decorative ideas, and slightly abandoning the meeting house shape. With two levels, a gallery and a ground floor, each with two levels of windows. It's much more a recognizable meeting house. In the Peacham Church's case, the gallery was removed and the windows were combined into the ones that we see now. And when we talk about the interior, we'll just go into the interior briefly. It appears that during the 1868 to 71 renovation, the interior of the church was fitted with this tin ceiling you see here. It was an extremely popular and relatively inexpensive way to bring decorative detail inside of the church. But the really remarkable thing that we found is in Sonia's office. So originally, if you can imagine the back of the church, in 1871, when the organ was donated, there would have been a large opening where Sonia's office is now. And that's where the organ would have been played from. This is only something that Susan and Sonia found out very recently. It's really interesting. And when you go into Sonia's office, if you manage to get into the closets and peek up at the ceiling, you can see that there's a part of the decoration of her ceiling that has been unchanged since the 1860s renovation, and it's picked out in really, really bright colors. This is another innovation that came after the Civil Wars. There was an explosion in different kinds of new pigments. You see this in sort of Queen Anne or late 19th century downtown districts, or in Montpelier. They're just a riot of color, and that's how they would have been originally. So originally the ceiling would have been picked out in these stenciled bright blues and greens and reds and turquoises. And I'm sure, we don't know for sure, but we can presume that that paint is still under there. But thanks to the Greek revival, we think of all New England churches as being white, so it tends to be the go-to palette for really any building of this type. So at some point it was all painted over with white, but luckily there is a little bit of surviving paint in Simon's office. And you can't see it here, but there's actually very, very faintly painted on the wall, there's about a 4-foot wide band of golden 5-pointed stars going all the way around it, which is really kind of amazing.
Beautiful.
My pet theory is that might have had something to do with the centennial, but
Yes.
I'm not sure.
We think so too.
But it's pretty remarkable. Yeah, originally meeting houses back in the day, in the sort of early 18th century, white wasn't even in the top 5 for the most popular colors for a meeting house. They were lime green, and they were sky blue, and they were bright red, and they were mustard orange, and they were really designed to leap out. So this, our churches are white now, but they weren't always as such. And so, as near as we can figure out, it sounds like and this is fairly recent, is that the organ was moved to its current location in 1901.
2 or 3.
1902, 1903.
1902 or 3. We
And
just
that's
found new
probably
documents.
when the walls in here got their tin, which actually is kind of a late
Yes.
application for barn tin, or it's not barn tin, it's
Yes.
it's patterned tin.
Yeah.
There was a huge fad for it in the mid to later part of the 19th century, and it tapered off very quickly into the 20th century. So it's later than I maybe would have anticipated, but that's probably the final decorative treatment in here, as far as I can tell. Yeah, go ahead.
So Adam, do you think if we took this tin off, that's what we would see?
I would suspect so. Yeah, I think that
It's up above.
it's difficult to know for sure, but the painted portion of the wall really only starts probably maybe 5 feet beneath this sort of these cartouches that run around the top of the wall. But it'd be worth looking into. It'd be pretty interesting to find out for sure.
If your pastor was ever given a choice, yes, we would start looking as to whether any of those existing colors do remain underneath this in the sanctuary. As near as we can tell from the snippet in my office, and we do have another view of this on the wall near the door here. The main core of the ceiling, the main portion of the ceiling in the middle was a yellow. Your grid lines were in like a deep turquoise. And then that shade is included elsewhere. There is, as you see, just the curve at the top of the cartouches, that the main color is a reddish, and then there is a stenciled turquoise and a deeper red floral pattern.
Yeah.
That goes around with it, and you can see it some in that picture at the back. But yeah, it would be incredible to just even if we had colorized photograph where someone could put in those colors, so we could get that idea of how vibrant the sanctuary was at one time.
And it really would have been vibrant for sure. And there are a few churches where this survives. If you actually go to the tiny Congregational church in Westfield, their choir loft is blocked off really to the public. But you go in there, and the brightly colored pattern tin hasn't been painted over yet. So it's really, really pretty spectacular.
And I just want to add that we do have photographs from the centennial in 1894. We also have some photographs from the 1870s. Of course, they're all sepia tone or black and white, but you can make out that there's quite a few colors. Right now, I'm on a mission to see if we can't find some type of photograph of what the organ in the 1870s with the choir loft looked like in the back. I haven't found a photograph. We have photographs with all of the decorative detailing on the tin and along the ceiling from both the 1870s and the 1890s, but nothing for the back of the church yet.
So we can have a great discussion and debate if we had $1 zillion to restore. Because from a preservation point of view, it may be we would not restore all to one period. Because what we're looking at represents innovations from different periods. And if we highlighted that, it might be different than what the organ, because that was before the organ was here and whatever. So that'll be interesting to research and if we want to move to preserve, what are we preserving? What are we preserving?
That's why we talk with people like Adam.
Adam, do you know of any churches that have done what Bruce just described?
Have restored the church to different time periods? Not that I know of. It's Generally, they're being restored to the best possible condition that they are in that exact moment. I'm not familiar, at least in Vermont, not familiar with any efforts to try and retrograde any parts of the building to a particular time period. But it'd be an interesting experiment and something we're talking about for sure. It's always the question about which historical narrative do you have an allegiance to? Are you bound to the historical course of the building up to that point? And what do you lose by going back to an earlier era? And that's one of the fun things to talk about, because there's not really a distinct or right answer. It's you advocate for the building as best you can, and that sort of guides you. Yeah, Ellie.
I was just wondering, is there anything in any of your correspondence that indicates why they got rid of the gallery?
Why they removed the gallery?
Yeah, why did they make this big change in design? And get rid of, I saw the gallery, meaning like above it, horseshoe-shaped balcony.
Yeah, that happened when they moved it down. Now, there was a gallery across the back, and how far it came out, we don't know. Again, I'm looking for photographs of that. We know it was along the back.
But nothing in the correspondence talks about the top and why.
We don't know. We're not all the way through. I mean, we're finding more and more correspondence, and I found two more boxes of early town documents that have never been looked at. And I've just started Diane Travis here in town is starting to help me look at those. We're looking at another whole project regarding those documents. But there's much that we can work with, and who knows what we're going to find. There are also financial records, which if we start to study those, that might tell us about the purchase of all these materials and what was going on with that. The box that we're calling the red box really ends around the 1870s. It doesn't go much past that. So that correspondence wouldn't give us any clue as to what's going on here, unfortunately.
Based on what I've seen in other churches, I think the question is one of capacity more than anything else. Old box pews are brilliant. They have a door, you go in, you're in a little cubby, your family, you all have your feet together because it's January and you're going to church for some reason. And you can actually, you have little coal heaters, you can actually heat the box up and you can keep it warm, and it's actually a way to survive church services in the winter. But they're not really very efficient as far as getting people into the church, and they're difficult to get to, and they're a pain to maintain. So you look at the Old West Church, and it's very beautiful with their box pews, but you see that you can't get too many people in there. And since each box pew is owned by a different family, it's tough to really sort of cram everybody in. So my guess is that after the Civil War, once people started putting in giant wood stoves that could actually have a reasonable chance of heating the congregation, that they were willing to put people closer together. That's just a guess.
Question, there weren't box pews in the galleries as a rule. The churches I've seen, the box pews are just on the main floor.
The Old West Church does have them
on
still.
the second floor. Ours did.
Yeah, according to the schematics that we have that were preserved from the early 1800s, originally the gallery was box pews.
Yes.
And the Stratfor townhouse got rid of their box pews on the ground floor, but they're still in the gallery.
We have the schematics and the accounting for the auction of the pews at the back of the sanctuary. I can show to anyone when we're wrapped up here.
The gallery pews are definitely cheaper because you got your own box pew, but it also tended to have a window in it, which also wasn't great for a January church service.
And just as an aside, Ed, I can tell you that the aisles were along the side. There were box pews that faced towards the center, and the box pews came all the way around, very close to the pulpit was pushed back, and the box pews filled the front of the church as well.
That's like Old West Church.
Yeah. And that's it for me, really. I mean, the spire is typically hilarious. It's got some great late 19th century eclecticism going on, whereas the rest of the decoration on the building tends to be fairly formal. The spire is pretty imaginative. It doesn't really hew to any particular type. It has Norman-style sort of arches within arches and really interesting, fun geometry at the corners where the posts are chamfered, and a frieze of pyramids running around the top of it. So it's that great sort of late 19th century, let's borrow whatever architectural style we want just to grab people's attention. It makes sense, especially if you're competing with the church across the road.
Are you going to talk at all about how the heck they moved this?
Well, very slowly is probably the easy answer, but more often than not, it would have been jacked up and placed on log rollers and very carefully winched and pulleyed down the hill, and then I think actually, like you say, reoriented 90
They had to
degrees.
turn it as well.
It's not just a center.
No, they moved it intact. The record shows that they made it 12 feet longer after they brought it down. And that does not include the front or back additions.
It also speaks to the confidence they had in the immense strength of the frame to be able to take that kind of thing. An elevation change as well as an orientation change over that distance is a lot.
Adam, have you literally gotten upstairs either with a ladder or using heavy equipment, cranes or something?
No, I mean, there's no room to get up there with heavy equipment, unfortunately. I have been into the attic a few times.
I've been up there.
It's great. Pretty much every historic building expert or timber framer worth his salt has kind of made it literally a point of pilgrimage to visit this roof, because it really is that good. A lot of roofs would rely on iron strap work or any other kind of hardware to help restrain the cords together, and everything up there is just hand-shaped mortise and tenon wooden joinery. So it's great. It really is great.
What about the first floor?
The first floor would have been pretty conventional. We can go back to the first slide of the barn. There really wouldn't have been anything unusual. They're likely large dimension 12 by 12 straight posts just coming from a sill timber to braces up to the rafter plate. Really, really very conventional construction.
You have a question here?
I'm just curious. It was moved downhill at a point where it was losing members of the congregation, if I understand
No,
correctly.
I think what they wanted to do was gain more. So they were stable.
Because I was going to ask about
But
it.
it was a way of making themselves much more accessible and front and center and right within the community as a mechanism to gain more members.
Okay, because I was curious that they've extended the capacity of the sanctuary here.
Yes.
What would have been the population of Peacham at that time? Because they were sharing with another church, and it just astounds me that there was room for,
Well, they were
seems like
actually,
more room than people.
what I can tell you is, what was it, 1,200, 1,400? I'd have to look up the exact number. And there was more than one church. I mean, I could have a whole discussion about what the Baptists were doing all around the outskirts of Peacham. They were planting churches here.
There was also, sorry, didn't mean to step on you there. There was also a huge expansion in membership of the Congregational Church at one point. So at one point, we were the second largest church in the entire state. There was a 2-year period when approximately 150 people, additional people, joined the church. This church, yes.
Sonia, do you know if that was when Reverend Merrill was here?
I don't recall the time. I don't recall the time period on that.
One of the things I've been researching is the second minister of this church, Reverend Merrill. And it's a long story, but I was able to track down his work out in Ohio as a young man. And I think Merrill is a central figure. He becomes the minister here at a time period when they're going to move the church. He was part of the decision to move the church down here. When he was out in Ohio, he planted 2 churches. Actually, one existed, and he planted a second church. And he was in the Springfield, Urbana, Beaver Creek area. He brought in 350 new members during the couple of years that he was out there. But what's interesting is shortly after he married his second wife, his first wife died. We still don't know why. He married a woman by the name of Mary Grandin Hunt, who was his second wife. And shortly after their marriage, a tornado came through and blew apart the church. And he was very active in rebuilding the church and learning a great deal about church construction. And the fact that they moved the church right after he became minister, he knows about churches, he knows about expanding a church, he knows how to bring membership in. I think that there's an untold story about his role in all of this and how the church blossomed under his care.
This is new.
Adam, when we remove all the nasty vermiculite, are we likely to learn anything?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Because we'll get down to whatever planking.
Undoubtedly, yeah. You'll learn a lot about the way that the ceiling joist joinery is put together. You'll reveal a lot more marriage marks, assembly marks for the building. You'll be able to get more granularity in terms of the actual nature of construction. I have no doubt in my mind that you'll learn something. I can't say exactly what it is, but it's always helpful to uncover as much as you can.
Maybe someone left something behind. I mean, that happened in old buildings during construction. Sometimes things are left. Things get left in walls and...
If people look up on the wall over here, in fact, these are the types of things that can be lost and rediscovered. In 1998, during a church clean-out session, someone said, "What's that?" over the men's bathroom downstairs. And they hauled it down and discovered that it was that weather vane. And there is a question as to whether that is actually the original weather vane from the old meeting house when it was up on the hill. We have no idea how long it had been there, but that was
in this picture.
One of our discoveries. And for those of you who know and love Lorna Quimby, the meeting house minutes, that picture of the old meeting house, which I believe is the same one that Adam showed on the slide. If you take a very good look at the top of the cupola, you'll see that there is a weather vane in that picture.
Has a similar shape.
Do you know anything about the authenticity of that engraving?
Authenticity of the engraving? No, I'm not. I don't believe we have tracked down yet, although we're discovering things all the time.
And it does appear in Ernest Bogart's book. And when Elsie Choate died, there was a legacy left for him to write the book. He was commissioned through the Vermont Historical Society to write the history of Peacham, using materials that Elsie and some others here in town had collected for scores of years. We have not found the original of that engraving. It appears in his book, and one has to wonder if it was part of the collection that burned in the library in 1959.
His book was published when?
I have a copy of it here, actually. I could tell you the exact year. For anyone who is not familiar, we have reprinted the book, and it is for sale through the Historical Association. There's a lot of information. The original just had a dark cover. But let me just tell you the original date on this. I believe it's the 40s.
That's my recollection.
1948. Was
Possible this is a bogus modern reimagining.
We don't know. I don't think so. It's based on something. Ernest Bogart would not have put something. He was a very thorough historian, and my guess is that he had access to an earlier engraving.
I guess that's the nice thing about the meeting house church form, though, is that you have a meeting house with an engaged tower in northern New England. It's pretty much going to look like that.
Do we have any other questions for Adam or Susan? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for coming today and joining us. We, as with any older buildings, this building is beautiful shape that it's in. Like all buildings, we have issues that need to be dealt with, conditions that we need to address. This church continues to play a huge role, not simply as a house of worship, as a place of worship, but as a community center, as that core of the community. So we do everything from serve as a home for elementary school concerts to hosting other groups to come in, a meeting space, used as a meeting space, Aging Well in Peacham, for example. So we're a small congregation with a huge, beautiful, historically vitally important building in this town. And so we ask those of you who are able to consider donating toward the preservation of this building and assisting the population of the church family that is here to help preserve this for another 215 years so that we can continue to serve this community as we have in the past. So I'd like to thank you for coming, and I want to also thank our presenters for the day.
Oh.
So
Oh, my
thank you.
goodness, thank you.
Thank you so much for all your help and your effort and the...
Thank you very much.
I didn't think you were going to get the same one.
And for suggesting that sometimes sledgehammers are the best ways to approach bad office closets.
Yes. A useful tool in the arsenal of historic preservation.
Yes, there we go. So thank you all.